Honorable Chair, today the motion before us is this House supports the rise of students taking gap years before and during their post-secondary education. Now, let me reiterate what a gap year is. A gap year is a planned break, typically taken between stages of informal education, during which individuals pursue activities such as travel, work, volunteering, or skill development. Now, before I present our substantive arguments, let me establish the framework for today's debate by outlining what both teams must prove to win this motion. Now, to support this motion, our team, the proposition team, must demonstrate three key claims. Now, first, we must prove that gap years provide meaningful benefits to students that justify interrupting the traditional education process. Now, second, we must show that these benefits extend beyond the students, but also to the higher education system as a whole. And third, we must establish that the rise of gap years, meaning the increasing trend, represents a desirable thing and worthy of support rather than resistance. Now, conversely, the opposition must prove otherwise, and they must prove that the gap years are bad and the trend should be regretted. Now, let me move on to our first line. Our first line is that gap years are an alternative to traditional burnout culture and improve efficiency and outcomes of higher education systems. Now, consider the reality of modern education right now. Students progress through a relentless conveyor belt. Then primary schools flow into middle school, they flow into high school and go into university. Now, this system operates using industrial logic. They minimize the gaps and they treat education as a production line. But human beings are not products. We are human, and learning is not just manufacturing. This continuous pressure creates burnout culture, where students arrive at university already exhausted from years of academic competition, standardized testing, and the constant pressure to achieve. Now, they enter post-secondary education not with enthusiasm and curiosity, but with depletion and obligation. They choose majors because they seem practical or prestigious and not because they've genuinely discovered genuine passion or aptitude. They study mechanically. They complete assignments and accumulate credits while remaining disengaged from the actual process of intellectual growth. Now, the result, universities face epidemic levels of students' mental health crisis, skyrocketing dropout rates, and the classrooms filled with physically present but intellectually absent students. This isn't efficient, it's very wasteful. We pour resources into educating students who aren't ready to benefit from that education, who haven't developed the maturity or the motivation to engage meaningfully with their studies. Now, gap years, they offer a different model. Now, by inserting a pause into this progression, they allow the students to step off the conveyor belt and to breathe, to recover from academic exhaustion. And this break doesn't represent a failure of efficiency. It represents a recognition that sustainable learning requires sustainable learners. Now, when students return from the gap years, they return with their mindset change. They bring focus where there was previously confusion, and this clarity, it transforms into an educational experience. Now, students who know why they're studying, they study more, they engage more deeply with the coursework, and they're less likely to drop out or change majors repeatedly because they've already explored their interests and confirmed their commitment. Now, from the institution's perspective, this represents a very massive efficiency gain. Universities achieve better outcomes. They higher completion rates and stronger academic performances with the same resource investment. The gap year doesn't create an efficiency, it eliminates the inefficiency of educating unmotivated, unprepared students who just take minimal benefit from the education. And this challenges our fundamental assumptions about educational efficiency. The current system, it measures efficiency.
POI?
Yes, I will take that POI.
You talk about how it actually reduces burnout culture, but in the status quo, what we see is that people who actually do take gap years, they have a higher pressure to actually relearn the information that they receive from high school because they're not constantly like thinking about it during their gap year. They think the gap year is for travel, it is for holiday. How do you respond?
Now, the thing is, gap year isn't only for holiday. From what I said earlier, from the definition of a gap year, it's also work, volunteering, or skill development. These are some skills you just cannot get from traditional schools, and it increases your. Please do not badger with POIs, and that is the reason why gap years are just so different. It's because they let us learn skills that are previously unable to achieve. Now, our second line is that gap years, it allows young people to experience personal development and develop maturity. Now, let me address why the gap years it produced such a substantive change. Now, the answer lies in what gap years provide. Now, gap years provide development and maturity that formal education just cannot replicate. Now, consider independence. In traditional education, students move from their parents' home directly to universities, and they haven't learned enough independence. While universities offer more freedom than high school, they remain fundamentally institutional. And gap years, in contrast, they provide they require the students to navigate the world without these institutional frameworks. And whether they're working, traveling, or volunteering, they must solve these problems independently, and they must manage finances, and they must negotiate the unfamiliar situations. And that's why they can learn skills that are outside of the traditional system. Now, this isn't just abstract character building, it's practical competence development. Now, students learn, they learn to research opportunities, they learn to limit budgets, they learn to communicate across cultural contexts. And these capabilities, they don't emerge from textbooks or lectures. They develop through direct experience or consequences and responsibilities. Now, perhaps most importantly, gap years facilitate, they broaden the perspective of the students and the understanding of themselves and of the world. And they develop, when they volunteer in communities facing different challenges, they develop empathy. When students work alongside people from different socio-economic standards, they understand class dynamics that were just like previously were abstract. And now this broadens their perspective just fundamentally, and it changes how the students approach education. They recognize learning not as isolated credit acquisition, but as preparation for engaging with a very complex and diverse world. Now, in conclusion, the rise of gap years, they represent a positive rise in how we approach education and human development by offering an alternative to burnout culture and by providing a space for independence, resilience, and broader perspectives. They enable the maturation that transforms education into something that's worthwhile. This is why you should support our side. Thank you.
From our first line of framing, I would like to note the burden, which is quite similar to governments in this case. So, what we think they need to prove in this debate to win is that the change is good, the change is necessary, while the status quo is necessarily worse than what their alternative actually is, and why this change has the least backlash out of a whole list of other changes that could possibly happen. Right? What we then need to prove under this debate is that this change is actually inherently bad. It causes like many harms or backlashes compared to the status quo, and that is our win condition. That is our path to victory in this debate. So, 2 points, okay? First of all, it actually causes more people to then take a gap year, right? What we see under this is that, first of all, it's a herd mentality, meaning that once, like even a small minority of people actually opt into this gap year, or like maybe 10 or 15 people actually take this gap year. More and more people actually build onto the cycle of taking gap years because they think other people are doing it. It's starting to become a trend. I think it's a good time for me to actually try this, right? What this actually means is that because there is a herd mentality, all the gaps in their learning and all the harms within the actual debate actually apply to everyone who actually opts into this herd mentality, and it means that if there's a fire or like problem or a virus across the cohort, everyone actually gets to this problem, and it's not just a small minority, right? What then does this mean? Uh, I want to note one thing under this mechanism, that it's mainly the people who aren't like actually more academically have it's mostly the people who don't have as much academic ability who actually start this cycle. They think that they've had like lots of time in high school where they're actually studying, having lots of stress, and they think they deserve this like gap year. But the problem with thinking that you deserve a gap year is that most of the time you actually opt into things like just resting in the holiday, resting in your gap year, right? Or not doing anything productive, right? This is directly because people actually think it's an excuse for them to take a break, right? They promise themselves that like they'll actually get better once they get into college, but this actually never mostly happens because they're unable to opt back into the college environment because they have had a whole year of like changing their habits, like making bad self-assessments, and this is the direct problem with these gap years, right? Because it actually fosters a place where people are actually less prone to learning and more prone to taking vacations, right? Where they then wouldn't be used to the college environment or what they've already learned from high school, right? The impact then is that people are less sensitive to the studies, and it's harder for them to like get back into what they've already had. And the inherent harm actually comes from the habits that people develop, like For example, lots of people in these gap years actually choose to slack off, right? They choose to spend most of their time like enjoying vacation instead of revising, as what opposition suggests would be the alternative to do. And why is this true? It's because it's directly actually because they think it's an excuse, because they think it's an escape, and because they think that they deserve this. They deserve this, and I've already proved to you why this mindset is inherently like really harmful to your learning as like someone who's just about to go into college, right? Because this directly means that you don't have like the mindset or the or like the preparation for you to go into college compared to what you would have had if you actually like just like went straight to like college or university from high school, right? Second point is that people could drop out really easily, right? The mechanism here is that because people actually choose to act recklessly in their self-assessments during these holidays or like these gap years, right? We tell you that the most like likely thing that they're like we already told you that the most likely thing that they're going to do in these like gap years is like slack off or like minimize their productivity in our worst case and in their best case, right? And what this means is that like when they actually go back into college, considering it's their first year, right, and they don't really have a lot of experience, they're
POI.
likely to find it harder to actually they're likely to find it harder to actually relearn how these skills that they should have learned in high school. I'll take you on your POI.
So if you say that recklessness just defines the gap years, why do structured programs, internships, and volunteering during gap years they consistently show higher responsibility and clear career goals after?
I want to note on like your POI why this is likely not to be true, right? Lots of people they think that like other people might do this, but I don't have to because it's a gap year, right? I should take a break, right? Because this herd mentality, although it does apply to being lazy, it doesn't actually apply to hard working, right? Although some people might actually opt into these like voluntary camps or like these like relearning processes, it's actually like just it's actually directly voluntary, meaning lots of people don't actually want to do it, right? They want to enjoy their gap year for what they've already had. And then, like, in the vast majority of cases, what people actually do instead of being productive is promising that they'll be more productive when they get into college, which is directly a fake promise because most of the time it's really hard for them to get back in the environment which they've already built upon in high school. Continue on my case, right? The second mechanism for my point, right, is that they forget most of the things in high school, leading to the high pressure to relearn everything, right? For example, in high school, you might learn how to deal with the pressure, right? You might learn lots of like academic basics that would help you in your college university, right? But then when you've taken a gap year, it's harder for you to remember, right? It's less concise even if you do remember it. And when you actually take a long time to like re-opt it back into your memory, you realize that it's less detailed of what you've already had. I think government might respond by saying something like notes or like you can review your notes, but I would just like to note how this is like highly inefficient because it would just be a much better alternative if people didn't take this gap year and the harms would just be really low. So we think that like the things you get out of this gap year is like much less than the things that you actually risk to lose in these gap years, right? So note how these two mechanisms directly respond to 2 points of opposition. First of all, their point is about how it helps with self-development. But I would just like to note how this is an assertion, and because people actually choose to act recklessly, which I've already proved, this actually like completely contradicts their point about how it creates self-development. Second of all, this is responsive of their point about how people will come back fresh and ready to ace their tests because it directly tells you how people make a fake promise to themselves. Okay, the importance then, right? Why is it so important? Because when you drop out, you get less job opportunities. It's harder for you to find a job that actually requires the minimal skills that you have, right? Or like doesn't require the mainstream skills that you don't have. Well, let's be charitable and say that people aren't going to drop out. What the alternative then would be is the pressure to refamiliarize yourself with high school stuff because no matter how hard you work, you will always, in the vast majority of cases, be behind. Know how this directly responds to burnout culture? Because the problem when gap years are normalized is that people are more vulnerable to learning, leading to more burnout. And yeah, thank you.
One. I want to respond directly to the opponent's arguments because a lot of what they said comes from a misunderstanding of what a gap year actually is, according to the motion. The motion clearly defines a gap year as a planned break taken between stages of formal education, where individuals pursue activities like work, volunteering, travel, or skill development. This is important. A gap year is not just doing nothing, it is an intentional and structured. So when the opponent keeps talking, their whole speech was all it totally went against this. They talked about how students are just slacking off or taking a break, but they are not debating the motion. They're debating something else entirely. First, the idea of a gap year is it will become a trend and everyone will follow the crowd, as they said. Even if students choose to take gap years, that does not automatically mean a bad thing. Choosing to work, volunteer, or gain skills is not a herd mentality. It is a rational decision made in response to rising academic pressure, career uncertainty, and financial stress, which I will also be explaining more in my arguments. Calling the herd mentality ignores the real reasons students make these choices. Next, the claim that students will think they deserve a gap year and do nothing productive. Again, this is directly contradicting the definition. A gap year involves planned activities. If someone is working, volunteering, or building skills, they are being productive. This does not mean that they are slacking off. The opposition is assuming laziness without evidence and ignoring the structure that defines a gap year in this debate. They also argue
POI.
students opt back into college environment after a gap year. This is simply not true. Thousands of students return to education after taking gap years, and they often perform better. Universities themselves allow and even encourage deferred admissions. If reintegration was truly a problem, these institutions would not support it. The opposition also claims that students become less sensitive or less serious about their studies, but in reality, taking time away from constant academic pressure often makes students feel more focused. When students choose education instead of rushing into it, they value it more instead of less. The idea that students lose habits or slack off again assumes that structure only exists in school. Work environments also have schedules or expectations that they need to take responsibility and accountability in. Volunteering still requires a commitment. And skill development takes discipline. These experiences build a habit rather than destroying them. Finally, they said that even students who do not take gap years still feel academic pressure. That does not weaken our case, it instead strengthens it. If pressure exists either way, then providing students with an option that reduces burnout and improves preparedness and it is a solution instead of a problem. Overall, the opposition's arguments rely on fear and assumptions rather than actual definition in emotion. A gap year is planned, purposeful, and productive. Before I continue, what's your POI?
My POI was that previously you mentioned how in these gap years, the motion actually states that you can take these self-development cases into consideration. But the problem is that these self-consideration things are actually just merely optional. They're not a planned program for that is highly recommended or for people to actually be compulsory, and it's just a suggestion, and I've already proved why most people actually don't take this. And how do you respond?
Well, as I've said, the definition has already mentioned this is a planned activity. There is a reason that people take gap activities. If you say it's just to relax and to slack off, that is simply not true. If we say that they're gonna take a gap year and they're not gonna do anything, then it's the same as saying they're gonna finish school and they're not gonna do anything with their lives. Because clearly, if they're slacking off during a gap year, then they clearly do not care even after they go to school. So now I want to focus on two key benefits of having a gap year: the development of real-world skills and employability, and the financial benefits of working during a gap year. But more importantly, I want to show you on how these benefits extend beyond just the students themselves, which the other team failed to do. First, real-world skills. When students take a gap year to work or to volunteer, they are not just helping themselves, but they are instead contributing to the whole community and organizations around them. Students fill real roles inside the world. They're able to volunteer or let's say take healthcare support, and they're able to help nonprofit organizations, improving the learning environment for everyone instead of just themselves. From a broader perspective, students who take gap years often make more informed choices about their education and careers. This reduces program switching and dropouts. That benefits schools by lowering iteration rates and making the classroom feel more focused and engaged. It also benefits society by creating graduates who are better prepared for the workforce and also more confident in their own career paths. Now, looking at a financial aspect, working during a gap year allows students to save money for tuition and living expenses. Not everyone is able to have all the money to instantly go into university or into college. This reduces reliance on the student loans, which do not just help individuals, but also helps their whole family who may otherwise carry financial strain because not everyone is as financially stable as the other team assumes. Less debt also means graduates are less financially burdened and they're able to contribute more to the economy even after graduation. This also lowers the amount of stress during the school, since when you're in school, you want to be purely focusing on what you're going to be doing in the future and preparing for your education for that. Well, instead, if they're piling tons of student debt, they're going to be simply worrying about that itself. Student with are more likely to start investing in institutions and careers. We're not just supporting students taking time off, but we're instead supporting stronger communities and more prepared workers, healthier education systems, and more stable economies. While the other team based their whole argument and their whole first-person speech basically on assumptions that people are simply going to slack off and relax because taking gap years reduces the pressure. But instead, we're telling you that our house supports the rise of students taking gap years because it supports the whole world and not just focusing on students itself, which means that this will not just benefits the future, but also benefits the world that is already happening around them. And that's why you should vote proposition. Thank you.
We don't allow and support students to take gap year. It's just that we don't support this rise. So why is this rise likely to happen in the first place, especially under the House's support? Because the clarification here, the evolution culture, especially in Asia countries, still exists, and the conservative ideas still exist inside the old generation's mind. So the human nature is actually slacking off because the human nature is to search for rest, while the gap year is actually rectified as finding career jobs, experiencing as what you've said, so nobody can verify what you're actually doing. The problem and the rebuttal to what you have said about limiting budgets and volunteering, as the prop has claimed, is a problem of unknown and lack of monitor, because this needs extremely high self-discipline while seeing those peers outside and playing, while also having the money and time to do so when you have the ability, when you think that you have the ability. And this is actually because without assessments, there's almost no monitor for what people are learning, and for most people, they're saying they're actually doing the things that they're playing anyways. So the teenagers, they're likely to, before and during the post-secondary education, they want to have a natural search for freedom, while their urgency of study mostly come from the indoctrination of their parents and their surrounding of saying that they're suffering from poverty and they need to learn. Well, they're actually lack of the real experience of what the urgency of survival is, which means that they're actually ignorant when they get the money and the time and they actually spend it on playing because of their natural interest, instead of actually wanting to have the urgency of survival and learning experience from these kind of gap years, which is also very low compared to getting into an academic university. And according to Peer, they have the FOMO of fear of missing out from everybody surrounding them, and especially those rich peers. They claim that, oh, everybody's having a gap year, why don't you have one? And also, while everybody chase after, they have the high jealousy and discontent of the surroundings and feeling that I want this life as well. But originally, they have the high incentive of learning, but now they're facing the they have the high incentive of going on the gap year, while they're still facing and opposes from family and pushing them to do and sustain their normal life. But why does this rise give a chance? Because it normalizes resting. It gives them an excuse, a right and normalized excuse to fight back the parental indoctrination or even lie about their behaviors. That gap year is time and money consuming and high standard, while lowering the original incentive of working harder after they come back, because they lower the sense of guilt. No, originally, even if they get the money to go on the gap year, they feel the sense of guilt because not most people do so, and they also feel the guilt for lying to their parents. But now they don't feel guilty anymore because they don't feel guilty anymore because their sense of guilt is killed by seeing that everybody else is doing so, and they can excuse themselves that gap year is also acceptable because we do it for learning, because we do it for my better development. But this is actually not the case when they spend it on playing, which have high incentive to do so, and they also kill their incentive to work harder even after, because also because, like, as my first speaker has mentioned, that they have low ability to go back into normal life. The tipping point is because of the governmental support helped them to make this excuse and push the force against their parents, and the government support is very harsh. And so even though the gap years the groups of people could be suffering from poverty and the necessity to find an urgent job to improve themselves and fight for a living, this is a high manipulation to those teenagers of ignorance, telling them to go to a gap year and then fail. So this is actually also, I will prove our opponents talk about the burnout culture, where people have more anxiety after the after the gap year. They talked about the burnout culture, and I will prove a counterfactual world. So we have already proved that burnout culture would burnout people would actually have more anxiety after the gap year. But even in the best case scenario of your case, the slacking off trend, with the most students got the excuse, as I have mentioned, to lose their academic willingness and really decrease the anxiety after. This is actually a bad thing, because first, it decreases the desire of mobility because of too much freedom, and this is a normalized behavior of which you call so-called limited budget and culture, and highly possibly they have low regulation and monitor, which students will indulge instead, because this is human nature. And because that this would not and because a resting life is a lot easier than busy academic life, the problem is the involution culture still exists because it's caused by population and cannot be eliminated by gap years. That means that people already had the habit of an easier life, which means that they're harder to get back to a normal life, as my first speaker has mentioned. And people feel like they have experienced gap year and back to college are harder to learn because it makes them less competitive, especially when they have low academic results, meaning that they will be extremely harmful for those suffering in poverty, because first, they cannot have a sustainable job to pay salary because of their low competitiveness, and second, people from gap year, as the prompt claimed, that this will broaden their horizon, and we will prove that this is actually a bad thing, because a pretended feeling that I'm capable of everything and the broader world makes you more vulnerable when you suddenly drop down and realize that I cannot change anything, especially in my life, instead of poverty. This lowers the confidence and the feeling of and increases the feeling of inability and kills their incentive and well-being inside their normal life, because the freedom of eyesight to those that cannot change the environment is a torture instead when you have. But ignorance, on the other hand, increases the well-being, because at least people feel like they at least they can't see the people around them, and they can't see the broader world. And so that is why the rise is so important, because if the rise increases and people sees everybody around them, originally they could not, for example, they can even not know that gap year exists, but without the government advocating, but now they know, and the feeling of inequality and lack of excuse was the inequality rises, and the lack of excuse was completely eliminated. So, and the rise also stigmatizes people that have the groups of people who learn regularly, because they face being opted out or being isolated or criticized when everybody's around you, which also increases the rate of opting out, because their burden is you have the burden to prove that why are they so resistant to bear against the environment around them. And in your case, you talk about practicality. It isn't necessary to have gap years. We have better alternatives. For example, having voluntary experiences while during lectures, while spending less time, because actually these kind of gap years only increases the time span, but you don't need so much time to do the volunteering job. You can sustain it while having the studying trade. And also, confusion will more likely to be in your case of cannot adapt to back after they have the gap years, ruining their life by cycle, as my first speaker has mentioned. So that's all. Thank you.
Now, as the government has shown, continuous academic pressure often leads students into post-secondary education by being burnt out, uncertain, and financially strained. Now, gap years offer students the time and space to recover, mature, gain real-world experience, and make more informed decisions before committing to higher and stronger engagement and more sustainable success in the long term. Now, in this speech, I'll be providing refutations as well as rebuilding my team's points and weighing our points to show why the pro side clearly wins this debate. I would like to start with the weighing. Now, first, the opposition's concern is limited to the speculative individual level risk. that students may misuse a gap year and temporarily lose academic habits. Now, even in the near impossible chance this occurs, the harm is short-term and reversible, as students can re-establish routines once they return to structured education. Now, by contrast, that benefit governments shows under L3 are systemic and long-lasting because work experience, skill development, employability gains persist well beyond gap years and directly affect students' long-term academic engagement and career outcomes, because this does not only last them until university, but lasts them beyond university and potentially towards their entire life. Now, on scope and durability, a temporary loss of routine for a minority of students cannot outweigh the widespread and lasting advantages of real-world preparedness that gap years provide. Now, second, opposition's second concern rests on speculative misuse of money by a minority of students, while ignoring the structural financial reality of higher education. Now, even if some students spend earnings irresponsibly during a gap year, that harm is individual and temporary. Now, by contrast, entering university immediately imposes guaranteed and substantial costs: tuitions, living expenses, long-term debt, and there's many, many more that I could say on every student. Now, gap years reduce exposure to these costs by allowing students to,
you keep on talking about burnout in these students and how it how this gap year is designed for them to come back stronger. But I think you completely actually just ignore how there are designated breaks already in the status quo that are designed for students to take a break now while not actually forgetting everything that they've already had. How do you respond?
Now, the thing is, these little breaks, they may not be enough for students. As said, post-secondary education is them finishing high school, their entire school life, and between these breaks, they may not only be a break. As I said before, there can be a way to earn income. There can be a way for them to maybe take a long break for once, and before they go to other opportunities for a gap year compared to a normal holiday. Now, furthermore, on this magnitude uncertainty on this weighing, then the financial burden of immediate university attendance is far greater and far more widespread than the hypothetical risk of misused gap year earnings. Now, I would like to move on to my rebuilding. The opposition claims that once students take a gap year, they will quote-unquote slack off, lose discipline, and become incapable of returning to academic environments. Now, this is heavily flawed. Why? Because not only have they misdefined the entire term of gap years, more importantly, opposition never explains why this risk uniquely applies to gap years and not the status quo. Now, students who enter post-secondary education burnt out, disengaged, or unsure of the direction are far more likely to lose motivation. Now, gap years directly address that problem by giving students time to gain clarity and purpose before committing to the higher education. Now, even if a small number of students misuse a gap year, that harms individual and temporary, and by contrast, the benefits government has shown, stronger employability and more academic motivation in the long term, are structural and long-lasting. Now, I would like to move on to my refutations. First, opposition's claim that gap years become a meaningless trend misunderstands both student incentives and the structure of gap years themselves. Now, trends only sustain when they provide value, and gap years require time, effort, and often financial responsibility through work or volunteering, or maybe internships, or many other examples. This is what gap years can be for. They give time for these opportunities. This is not just something that they do passively or something they consume without a sense. It is an active choice that demands planning and commitment. Now, education systems routinely adapt to common pathways such as internships, exchanges, and co-op programs, and many other opportunities I can say. And scale does not undermine value, because in this case, in gap years, students have way more opportunities that instead of when they almost instantly go into university education. Now, opposition never explains why more students making a deliberate, structured choice suddenly becomes a problem, rather than evidence that the model addresses a real need. Now, for the second opposition case, opposition extension on students wasting their financial resources relies on the assumption that students cannot manage autonomy responsibly. They argue that if students earn money during a gap year, they will spend it on leisure rather than productive use, and that others will take gap years out of FOMO rather than purpose. Now, once again, this is speculative and inconsistent, because first, students who go straight to university also receive money through allowance, loans, or parental support. Yet opposition never claimed this automatically leads to irresponsibility. Misuse of money is not unique to gap years. It is more of a matter of individual choice, not structural failure. And second, FOMO does not negate value. Students already make educational decisions based on trends, peer pressure, social expectations, and as a student myself, I feel this too, including rushing into degrees they are unsure about. Now, gap years provide flexibility instead of coercion. Those who choose gap years without purpose do not undermine the benefits for those who use them productively. Opposition never explains why the existence of poor individual choices justifies rejecting a pathway that delivers clear benefits for many. Now, finally, opposition's claim about limited budgets actually strengthens government case. How? Because gap years allow students to work, save, and reduce reliance on loans before entering with tuition fees, living expenses, and debt. I believe that both my other speakers have stated this before, yet they have completely ignored it. This shows gap years is more financially realistic than earning income and easing that burden beforehand. Now, finally, across this debate, opposition follows the same pattern. They repeatedly claim they will prove harm, but never actually do. Every major attack they raise, like slacking off, loss of discipline, misuse of money, FOMO-driven decisions, is built entirely on speculation about how students might behave, not on any structural mechanism that makes those harms inevitable or widespread. They assert outcomes without explaining why gap years cost them and why they persist, or why they outweigh government's demonstrated benefits. Worse, even if we accept their assumptions, the harms they describe against are individual, temporary, and correctable, and not directly related to gap years in a way. A government, by contrast, systemic and durable benefits in readiness, skills, employability, and financial stability. A case that relies on this could happen cannot defeat a case that we show that consistently improves outcomes. And for all these reasons, I am very proud to propose. Thank you for listening.
The failure of the entire government bench is to rely and over-rely on the info side, because their entire case is contingent on an assumption that they never proved, which is that students are actually going to work hard, they are actually going to take internships, they are actually going to do their personal exploration and whatever that is during this gap year. But we have proven to you down the bench that firstly, people don't make rational decisions when it comes to whether or not they should take a gap year, because we have proven to you that young people is a demographic that feels the sense of shame, that feels the sense of FOMO pretty acutely, which means that when this is a rising trend, people don't necessarily have that good self-assessment on whether or not they actually need a gap year, or whether or not they will actually do well and do better after this gap year and because of this gap year. Which means that a lot of people are just going to opt into gap years blindly. They lack experience to justify whether or not they can actually do well. So actually, it doesn't necessarily mean that a gap year is good for them. And secondly, I want to note that young people are just a demographic that have like less good self-assessment because they lack life experience, which means that they are far more likely going to make bad decisions, because at the time they don't see why they have to work really, really hard every single day. They feel like my parents can still support me financially. Why do I have to go to internships? And if I cannot afford my tuition fee, why can't I just apply for financial aid? They don't see the urgency of actually going to work, or they don't see the urgency of personal development, because that is just not a tangible topic, and it is really hard for them to imagine the actual good impacts that they are going to lay on their lives. Which means that when they compare themselves to other people who are probably going to be partying, who are going to be going on trips all around the world, they feel like I should be doing the same. And they justify this because they feel like other people are all doing that. So that is probably the right thing to do, which means that what they're going to do is they're just going to waste a year of their life. And this is the year in which they have the best physical strength, in which they have the best brain because of cognitive maturity to do anything that they want. And I think that it is really pathetic for them to take that risk. And all of those mean that they are going to be less competitive compared to their peers, because competitions are eventually going to arrive in their lives. They are going to face things like finding a job after they graduate from college, right? And that competition does not go away because everybody took a gap year. Maybe someone who didn't take a gap year are actually doing internships. They graduate 1 year earlier than you, which means that in the employer's eyes, they are far more capable than you, right? Because they have more time in their life in which they can actually devote into work. Which means they are far less likely going to hire you compared to your peers. And you're also going to face things like unemployment. And you're going to face a sense of cognitive dissonance when that time arrives, because you felt like you should be assured a year of leisure and relaxing. But actually, when other people are working hard and you felt like you weren't falling behind, but you actually are, when you actually have to face the reality, it is only going to be worse for your mental health. Secondly, I am going to prove why I think the status quo is pretty good, because colleges offer a lot of freedom, which means that burning out is not actually because you can also get a lot of leisure and relax in college. And also, people are becoming increasingly more open-minded because we themselves like freedom, which means that they are far more likely going to offer children more freedom in deciding what they actually want. If they're they are actually to some they talked about an argument on efficiency in education, which I think is still contingent on their assumption that students are actually going to use gap years effectively, because they claim that, oh, they are going to do personal development and stuff to actually make them explore their interests so they don't have to switch majors in college. Well, I would know that most students don't actually explore what majors they want to study in the future, because we have proven that they are far more likely going to be slacking off during the gap year, which means that you still have to face things like switching major, which in their minds are a waste of time. But you graduate 1 year later, which means that you just waste a year of your life randomly. Their second claim on financial benefits can be flipped because, first of all, that means that you are not resting and doing all the personal development and self-exploring stuff during the gap year because you have a limited amount of time, which means that you don't necessarily get all the rest of the benefits. Secondly, I think it is unclear why employers want to hire them because they have no work experience. The employers know that they will leave in 1 year anyways, and it might be illegal in some countries to hire minors. And thirdly, I think that if they really cannot afford their tuition fee, first of all, they can turn to financial aids. And second of all, like tuition fee for colleges is a huge amount of money. It's not like if you work for a year, you can pay for it, right? It means that you have to work and overwork during the course of your college, which means that you're probably going to do things like work 30 hours a week and fail your degree or something like that, which means that you miss the actual opportunity actually acing your academics and performing well in college and doing internships that are actually going to make you get like better job opportunities when you graduate. Lastly, I think just on the alternatives that we can offer instead of supporting a gap year, I think that we can just support more school breaks or minimize the frequency of tests or plan more school trips for different schools, which like prevents their problem of burning out in high school, makes people need a gap year to rest less. And also, I just think that it does not damage the coherence of learning and it keeps people in the good habits that are good for them. I think that even if we are charitable here and take their arguments to their fullest extent, people on our side still have the choice to turn to gap years because we're not opposing that. We're just supporting the status quo. So we still get all the benefits that they argue as well. But on their side, people who randomly turn to gap years just because of FOMO who don't really need a gap year. They just waste a year of time and they face unemployment and cognitive dissonance in the future, which I think is really tragic.
2, 1. How I'll be assessing this debate essentially is in 3 parts. First of all, the theme. Second of all, the burden. Third of all, charitability on both sides of the bench. So the first thing I want to note under the themes is that there are main 3 things that have appeared in this debate in forms of clashes. First of all, the academic slack, right? We tell you most students find it hard to get back in learning or spend more time reinforcing their habits as opposed to what they should be learning, right? Opposition comes out of this debate and tells you that this academic slack is actually untrue because people will actually like go into a system where they actually relearn everything and they actually like choose to do everything again in the gap here, right? So the first thing I want to know on this is that it's completely unnecessary to do this, but right, we've told you this from our first and second speeches. We told you the harms that outweigh the benefits the opposition asserts and claims to get in this debate, right? And we just tell you how like we get more you get more academic slack when you actually take a gap year because this gap year has proposes like essential inherent harms that could actually be really bad for not only you as a student but for the entire ecosystem of learning, right? The second thing missing then would be social reformity, right? They tell you there was a large clash here about whether people actually develop in these gap years, right? Gov says it's compulsory because it's in the topic and the info slide. So how we are going to clear this up is providing you with two alternatives and one charitable case, right? The first alternative is that in our best case, right, we tell you that most people actually choose not to do this because we've already told you from our first speaker speech that the main advocation for this gap year is to take a break, right? The main motive for the herd mentality is to tell people that they have that chance to take a break, right? Second of all, in our worst case scenario, which is in opposition's best case scenario, if we are being charitable, we assume that people actually choose to do this, right? But it's mostly about habit development, right? And the biggest narrative students opt into is that I already learned about this in high school. I don't need to relearn it again. And the problem here is that because students think in this mindset, what we see in gap years is that like they fail to actually revise because of their incentive. And when they don't revise, it's harder for them to get back into the environment of learning in college, or at least in our worst case, in their best case, find it hard to have to relearn and spend more time, which of the time they should be spending to learn more new subjects, relearning what they already should know if they didn't take a gap year. Third of all, government side responds to this partially by mitigating our case, and saying that students will get burnt out during continual education. However, we tell you two things, right? First of all, people actually would be likely to be burnt out after this gap year, right? This is because of our previous mechanism about how it's harder for them to opt back into the college environment. But and second of all, I think they completely ignore the existence of existing breaks, designed for students to take a break while not actually forgetting the prior knowledge. Also, I want to note that because opposite government side encourages students to take this gap year before their first year of college, it's actually really hard. It's much more harder for them because what you'll see is that they don't know what college is like, right? They don't know it's different from high school, and then they'll treat the expectations as the same as what high school would offer them, right? Okay, in terms of burden for this debate, they actually failed to prove why the status quo has a problem in the first place, right? Because the point to support their motive is actually that there is burnout, right? Which is a very small minority because there are breaks already, right? But even if so, the efforts and harms do actually outweigh the effects and benefits, meaning that it's completely unnecessary to begin with, but in fact can be harmful, as my first and second speaker have already talked about, right? So in terms of charitability as the last weighing metric, we tell you that they're very uncharitable, right? They always just assume, mostly assert their points. They assume everything goes their way, and they mainly assume that they mainly assert that people will do this, right? They're being very uncharitable. They don't really take our case into consideration, and how we actually succeed in this point about charitability is by telling you how why something is likely to why something is true and likely to happen, and why we still win in their best case, right? This is why we actually win this debate, and this is why I'm so proud to oppose.
Throughout this whole debate, we've already heard a bunch of arguments from the other team that have been assuming that the fact that during gap years people will simply slack off, they will be lazy, and that burnout is simply not real. Now, I will be explaining to you on why throughout this whole debate we've already shown on how it supports not just the students, but the students' families, the community globally, and also the schools itself. So I will now do some ways. So the first one is whether or not other solutions are possible to prevent burnout. So they've mentioned that the status quo has already given the students breaks specifically for burnouts, but our team instead has mentioned the fact that there's a difference between a gap year and the breaks provided by the status quo. As the definition from the motion, it has already been said that a gap year is already planned. It has a simple purpose. Well, the breaks given by the status quo is simply short and temporary, just as my third speaker has already mentioned. So the next is one of their biggest arguments, which was on FOMO, the fact that people will simply follow other people who take gap years. But this is simply not true. Even in their best case scenario, we still win. They've mentioned that the fact that more people will simply be taking gap years just because of the rising trend, and that they will spend it basically on just relaxing. But we tell you that a gap year is not that something that you can accidentally fall into, or just because you have the fear of missing out, but instead requires planning financial consideration and long-term decision making. It is not something that you can choose last minute just because you're not feeling like you want to instantly go back to school. The next one is that they've mentioned that people will spend on financial terms. They've mentioned that people spend a lot during gap years, but our team instead has mentioned that during gap years, the students are actually able to decide and they're able to experience a real part of the world, which is decision making financially. They're able to see their financial status and they're actually able to take interns or have more experience, which also leads to the next wave, which is on, they said, whether or not gap years will help jobs and careers. The other team has mentioned that some countries don't allow you to hire minors, or no company would want to hire people without any experience. But instead, our team will mention to you that this is the secondary post-term. So it means that you are not minors anymore. You're already an adult. And the fact that gap years will actually help you gain more experience instead. As we've said, gap years allow you to volunteer. It allows you to go for interns. This allows you to get experience after university. So it makes you way easier to find jobs. What makes you think that after you go to university, after that you will have more experience when you only went to school? Instead, a gap year allows you to gain this experience of the exposure from living and having responsibilities in the real world. Next is they've mentioned that students, whether or not there is urgency in the financial statement. The other team has mentioned that most students will have no urgency to even earn money during the gap year. But our team has mentioned that not everyone is in the same financial status. They're simply making an assumption that, every single family is able to pay off the university and all the student debt. But we're saying that a lot of people aren't actually financially stable enough to actually pay it off. So instead, if they don't take a gap year, instead these students will be ending up with piles of student loans, distracting them from the actual work if they do go to school. So from this, we've seen that the other teams have failed to even explain on why, in our best case scenario, that they still lose. And we're able to show you that this is the best option and the happiest for the long term, not just for us, but for everyone globally. Thank you.